Lessons 36 and 37 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 36. Westminster Abbey. Hitherto our attention has been confined to the city within the walls. It is time to step outside the walls. All this time, i.e. ever since peaceful occupation became possible, a town had been growing up on the west side of London. You have seen that formerly there spread a broad marsh over this part. Some rising ground kept what is now the Strand above the river, but Westminster, except for certain reed-grown islets, was nothing but a marsh covered over twice in the day by the tide. The river thus spreading out over marshes on either bank was quite shallow, and could in certain places be forded. The spot where any ford existed afterwards became a ferry. Lambeth Bridge spans the river at one such place, the memory of which is now maintained in the name of the Horse Ferry Road. The largest of these islets was once called Thorney, i.e. the Isle of Thorns. If you will take a map of Westminster, shift the bank of the river so as to make it flow along Abingdon Street, draw a stream running down College Street into the Thames, another running into the Thames across King Street, and draw a ditch or moat connecting the two streams along Delahay Street and Princes Street, you will have Thorney, about 1/4 mile long and not quite so much broad, standing just above high water level. This was the original precinct of Westminster. The Abbey of St. Peter's, Westminster, is said to have been founded on the first conversion of the East Saxons, and at the same time as the foundation of St. Paul's. We know nothing about the foundation of the church. During the Danish troubles the Abbey was deserted. It was refounded by Dunstan. It was, however, rebuilt in much greater splendour by Edward the Confessor. Of his work something still remains, and can be pointed out to the visitor. But the present Abbey contains work by Henry III, Edward I, Richard II, Whittington being commissioner for the work, Henry VII, and Wren, Hawksmoor, and Gilbert Scott, the architects. There is no monument on British soil more venerable than Westminster Abbey. You must not think that you know the place when you have visited it once or twice. You must go there again and again. Every visit should teach you something of your country and its history. The building itself, betraying to those who can read architecture the various periods at which its builders lived, the beauty of the building, the solemnity of the services, these are things which one must visit the Abbey often in order to understand. Then there are the associations of the Abbey, the things that have been done in the Abbey, the crowning of the kings in a long line from Edward the Confessor downwards. Here Edward IV.'s Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, took sanctuary when her husband suffered reverse. Here the unfortunate Edward V. was born. Here the same unhappy Queen brought her 2 boys when her husband died. Here Caxton set up his first printing press. Here is the coronation chair. Here is the shrine of the sainted Edward the Confessor. It is robbed of its precious stones and its gold, but the shrine is the same as that before which, for 500 years, people knelt as to the protector saint of England. This is the burial place of no fewer than 26 of our kings and their queens. This is the sacred spot where we have buried most of our great men. To name a few whose monuments you should look for, here are Sir William Temple, Lord Chatham, Fox, and Wilberforce among statesmen. Of soldiers there are Prince Rupert and Monk, Of Indian fame, here are Lord Lawrence and Lord Clyde. Of sailors, Blake, Cloudsley Shovel, and Lord Dundonald. Of poets, Chaucer, Spenser, Beaumont, Ben Jonson, Dryden, Prior, Addison, Gay, Campbell. Of historians and prose writers, Samuel Johnson, Macaulay, Dickens, Livingstone, Isaac Newton. Many others there are to look for, notably the great poet Tennyson, buried here in October 1892. Read what was written by Jeremy Taylor, a great divine, on Westminster Abbey. "A man may read a sermon, the best and most passionate that ever man preached, if he shall but enter into the sepulchre of kings. There the warlike and the peaceful, the fortunate and the miserable, the beloved and the despised princes, mingle their dust and pay down their symbol of mortality, and tell all the world that when we die our ashes shall be equal to kings, and our accounts easier, and our pains or our crowns shall be less." End of Lesson 36. Lesson 37. The Court at Westminster. Although the kings of England have occasionally lodged in the Tower, and even at Baynard's Castle and other places in the City, the permanent home of the Court was always, from Edward the Confessor to Henry VIII, at the Royal Palace of Westminster. Of this building, large, rambling, picturesque, only two parts are left, Westminster Hall and the crypt of St. Stephen's Chapel. When King Henry VIII exchanged Westminster for Whitehall, the rooms of the old palace were given over to various purposes. One of them was the Star Chamber, in which the Star Chamber Court was held. One was the Exchequer Chamber. St. Stephen's Chapel was the House of Commons, and the House of Lords sat in the old Court of Bequests. All that was left of the palace, except the Great Hall, was destroyed in the fire of 1834. Very fortunately the hall was saved. This magnificent structure, one of the largest rooms in the world not supported by pillars, was built by William Rufus and altered by Richard II. Here have been held parliaments and grand councils. Here have been many state trials. Sir William Wallace was condemned in this hall, Sir Thomas More, the Protector Somerset, Lady Jane Grey, Anne Boleyn, King Charles I, the rebels of 1745, Lords Kilmarnock, Balmerino, and Lovat, Earl Ferrers for murdering his steward. All these were condemned. One or two have been acquitted: Lord Byron, cousin of the poet, for killing Mr. Chaworth, and Warren Hastings, the great Indian statesman. In Westminster Hall used to be held the coronation banquets, at which the hereditary champion rode into the hall in full armour and threw down a glove. After the removal of the court, the hall became the Law Courts. It is almost incredible that 3 courts sat in this hall, cases being heard before 3 judges at the same time. In addition to the courts, shops or stalls were ranged along the walls, where dealers in toys, milliners, sempstresses, stationers, and booksellers sold their wares. A picture exists showing this extraordinary use of the hall. It is more difficult to restore ancient Westminster than any part of the City. We must remember that the Great Hall formed part of a square or quadrangle, on which were the private rooms of the sovereign, the state rooms of audience and banquet, the official rooms of the king's ministers and servants. This court led into others, one knows not how many, but certainly as many as belong to the older part of Hampton Court, which may be taken as resembling Westminster Palace in its leading features. The courts were filled with men-at-arms, serving-men, pages, and minstrels. They went backwards and forwards on their business, or they lay about in the sun and gambled. Sometimes there crossed the court some great noble, followed by 2 or 3 of his servants, on his way to a council; or a bishop with his chaplain to have speech with the king; or a group of townsmen after a brawl, who had been brought here with ropes about their necks, uncertain whether all would be pardoned or half a dozen hanged, the uncertainty lending a very repentant and anxious look to their faces. Or it would be the Queen's most excellent Highness herself, with her ladies, riding forth to see the hunt. This was the daily life of the court. We read the dry history of what happened, but we forget the scenery in which it happened, the crowds of nobles, bishops, abbots, knights, men-at-arms, serving-men, among whom all these things took place. We are apt to forget, as well, the extraordinary brightness, the colour, the glitter and gleam that belonged to those times, when every man went dressed in some gay livery, wearing the colours and the crest of his lord. Who rides there, the hart couchant, the deer at rest, upon his helm? A knight belonging to the court, one of the knights of King Richard II. Who march with the bear and ragged staff upon their arms? They are the livery of the Earl of Warwick. The clash and gleam of arms and armour everywhere, colour on the men as well as the women, colour on the trappings of the horses, colour on the hanging arras of the wall, colour on the cloth of scarlet which they hang out of the windows when the royal pageant rides along. Close to the palace, the Abbey. That, too, belongs to the time. Within the Abbey precincts the people are almost as crowded as in the palace, but it is a different crowd. There is not so much colour, no arms or armour, an orderly crowd. There are the Benedictine monks themselves, with their crowd of servants, cooks, and refectory men, brewers, bakers, clothiers, architects, builders, and masons, scribes and lawyers, foresters and farmers from the estates, stewards, cellarers, singing boys, organists. For the Abbey church of St. Peter is as great and as rich and maintains as large an army of servants as the cathedral church of St. Paul. End of Lesson 37. Recording by Ruth Golding.